Hello, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I had you guys waiting on that screen for like 15 minutes. My apologies. I had like a crap ton of stuff happening right there. Important emails came through that I needed to reply to right away, and then also doctor calling, and I'm just like, oh, okay. Well, let me just leave this to be starting soon screen going a little while longer. And here we are. So thank you guys so much for being patient today. I'm really glad. I'm really thankful that you guys all waited. I think we actually went up people as time went along. So you guys didn't just abandon me. Thank you. Thank you for not abandoning me. Um, thank you all just for tuning in. I'm trying to do more of these types of discussion streams. I imagine that no one's really going to be here today because if you're a Final Fantasy fan, you're probably playing Dawn Trail today. Now, I could have played Dawn Trail. I thought about playing it on stream actually, but I didn't really. Well, for starters, I haven't finished 6.5 yet. That's another thing too. And then I also don't know how well a Dawn Trail stream is going to do today on the first day of early access. I'm thinking that if I do a Dawn Trail stream today, no one would show up because no one wants to watch me play Dawn Trail on the first day. So for those who are curious about what I'm going to do about streaming Dawn Trail, I'm thinking the Dawn Trail stream starts next week, on or after official release. I don't know what you guys think about. Do you guys think that's fine? I wanted to give you guys a little bit of time to get ahead on Dawn Trail before I do, and then that way you guys can actively help with the duties. I mean, not the duties, the trials and the dungeons and everything. I tried logging in today, and it was weird because I couldn't figure out. There's supposed to be like a one button combo now, right? Like a simplified combo for like your 3-hit combo, but I couldn't find it. More time to moderate chat when it comes to spoilers, right? Exactly, and that's another thing too, is that like giving my mods a head start to be able to moderate the chat when it comes to being able to catch spoilers and all the other stuff. What is Dawn Trail? Dawn Trail is the new Final Fantasy 14 expansion. So, yeah, anyway, the queues are not bad. You can actually go and just log into Dawn Trail. Like, it's not like it's not another Inwalker situation where, you're stuck waiting for queue for hours. I remember when Inwalker was coming out, I would actually wake up at 7 or 8 a.m. We would start our streams around noon my time, and I'd wake up around 7 or 8 a.m. And from there, I would go and I'd sit and I'd log in and wait until the stream was actually going to happen. So I'd just be logged in, basically idling for 4 or 5 hours. And back then, idling was a little crazy too because you couldn't just idle, right? Because they had like max server capacity. So instead of just idling, you had to like flick the controller every 20 or 30 minutes so that the game wouldn't just log you out, right? And it was really nuts. Yeah, the queue was like 31 people when I logged in, which is pretty crazy. Is it FF17 news or is this FF14 news? It's neither. This is a community discussion. It's neither. We're going to be talking about a hypothetical Final Fantasy 17. But we're not going to be talking confirmed things today. So if you're hoping for confirmed news, then I'm sorry. However, if you're hoping to have a good community discussion if you're hoping to have your voice heard on stuff and listen to me ramble about things, then yeah, we're going to have a good time. Oh my God, Final Fantasy Union. Thank you. How's it going, guys? Hope y'all are doing well. So Daryl, I still need to have you on here, by the way. Like we keep scooting it back and scooting it back. We got to do that sometime in July, I think. Sometime next month, we got to finally sit down and make that happen. Um, anyway, today's discussion is going to be, it's kind of predicated on what I've been seeing a lot within the community. This discussion about the series being AAA versus AA. So essentially, ever since especially Jacob Novick spoke about this, and that was the former Square Enix, like, I guess you could call him an exec. He reported to two former CEOs. He sort of talked about this with Final Fantasy being AAA. And also, we got reports that Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth aren't selling quite as well as they should have. So there has been a lot of discussion on if the pursuit of AAA is still worth it. Now, that's not even just in the context of Final Fantasy, right? There's also the context of AAA games in general, right? We've been struggling when it comes to AAA. The industry, despite making record profits this past year, also laid off a record number of people. It's been really bad. And on top of that, too, AAA games need to sell a very absurd amount in order to be profitable, right? So, of course, this always goes back to Spider-Man 2, because that's the only game we have hard data for, right? We know Spider-Man 2 had to sell 7 million units, 7.2 to be exact, in order to break even. Not to profit, not to do decent, but for money to actually go above zero, they had to sell 7.2 million units. All right. So that's why you can hear, even with games like Final Fantasy 16, sell a pretty impressive number at launch, like 3 million, and then go on to sell whatever it's at right now. It's probably at least at 4 million. Like, I think that's a fair estimate. It's probably at least at 4 million. I think if it was at 5, if it was at 5 million, they would have announced it for sure. I don't think it's at 5 yet. I would estimate that it's probably 4-ish. That sucks because it's not like that's a small number, right? That's not a small number at all. That's a really good number, right? But then we have smaller AA games, right? A Persona 3 Reload, a Like a Dragon 8. Those types of games can sell 1 million units, right? Like 1 million units in their launch window, and the company be absolutely ecstatic. Because that is actually, like, really good, considering, like, what they spent to make those games. And so it's a very sustainable business model, right? And the thing is that each game, each generation is going to need to sell more and more and more, because AAA games are only going to get more pretty, have more features, have more content, etc., etc. And so it just gets more and more difficult for these AAA games to survive. And right now, AAA is kind of, I mean, you guys saw Summer Games Fest, right? Like, like what's really carrying the game industry right now? It's not AAA. It's more like, these smaller AA games, indie studios, a lot of Japanese AA games. That's kind of like really what's uh, holding 2024 together, right? Because if we relied on our typical AAA release to hold 2024 together, it would fall apart because there's not that big AAA release. Would Stellar Blade considered be considered double A? It's hard to say. I would consider it the absolute highest end of double A or the lowest end of triple. It's somewhere between those. Double A and free to play with a few AAA outliers, right? Right. And it's not like, and that's kind of, it goes back to the idea that 2024 is kind of a slow year or kind of a light year, which is a statement that causes a lot of discourse on the surface because a lot of people read that as a sort of flat statement, like, oh, there's no good games this year. And I don't think anyone is saying that. I don't think anyone really means that. I think what people are trying to say when they said that, like, 2024 is not really popping off, it's more about, you know, there's no AAA releases, right? Like the types of AAA releases that we typically expect to sustain the industry uh are not doing it. So what do we do, right? Do you think Visions of Mana will do well? It's kind of hard to say. I do think that it's a pretty neat looking game, but it is pretty hard for me to imagine that doing like super well in the West, just because I don't think the style of character is like really going to probably appeal to like a Western audience, but I think it can do decent though. I don't know if it'll blow up, but I think it can do okay. 2025 is absolutely stacked for AAA. Some quieter releases are going to happen. Quieter years are always going to happen and have almost that's fair. That's a fair assessment. I don't think that's necessarily a wrong take. I just think that we are kind of, seeing a little bit of cracks in AAA recently. And we look at the AAA industry and we look how hard it is for it to sustain itself versus where free to play is, and yeah. Kino, to answer the title question, yes, they should scale down the graphics. Even though Hi-Fi Rush got shut down, despite being a successful AA game, I think it had more to do with Xbox being stupid than anything else. People who use Hi-Fi Rush getting shut down as a counter argument aren't considering enough how much some higher ups in business can just really be dumb sometimes. Yeah, I agree. I do think that scaling down and going with more stylized graphics would be a good thing. Now, I don't think that they should scale down necessarily content or scope, right? I think that's also an important thing to define because if we say scale down, what do we mean by that? Because scale down can mean a multitude of things. Do we scale down, how long these games are? Do we scale down the amount of content? Are we just scaling down the budget and hoping that it should work somehow? So scale down does kind of have like a ambiguous meaning. And I kind of left it that way on purpose because I wanted to see which ways people interpret it. and leave room for people to make their arguments. To that frustrated Jacob, hello, man. Saw the title of the stream, and I'm sticking my head in to say that FF should absolutely scale down. They built their entire brand around being the most expensive, not necessarily quality. There's no reason Bravely Default couldn't have been a Final Fantasy, except that it wasn't expensive. Kind of true. No reason they shouldn't be making mid-scale titles to expand the fan base in between the AAA stuff. That's a very strong point. Actually consider making a video that is at least about this subject if I ever get the time. But I'm awfully busy lately. Have a good. I appreciate that. I think you have a great point there, Jacob. One that I can't necessarily disagree with, right? Like Bravely Default, right? And it's sort of just like Final Fantasy does have that brand around being this big, expensive AAA game now, right? And so would Final Fantasy fans accept something that wasn't a big, expensive AAA game that pushed graphics to its very limit? I think the challenge with Hi-Fi Rush is that even though it did well, the revenue slash profit they generated was nowhere near what they can make from the games like Starfield. I think that's a very good point, Daryl. Like, um, I think that's also kind of like what it comes down to. But I also think too that you know, um, Microsoft had said that they needed more games like Hi-Fi Rush, and they specifically even said that they did. But I think you're right in the sense that whenever they do the evaluation of it, they need more of those big AAA hitters, and they're looking at Hi-Fi Rush, even though Hi-Fi Rush was successful, and they're thinking like, okay, well that's not going to generate, that's not going to increase Game Pass numbers, right? But they will think that putting Call of Duty on Game Pass will. Shadow of the Erdtree has sold over 5 million. How much do you bet like Final Fantasy 17 is a Souls like? Okay, so I'll tell you this much. I think that if Final Fantasy 17 was made, or if the project started 2 years after it did initially, and they saw Souls, then I think Final Fantasy 16 would have had Souls-like elements to its I don't think that it would have been a Souls-like, right? Because I think that there's a lot of games that aren't necessarily Souls-likes that get called Souls-likes because they're a bit more weighty, a bit more grounded, and they do take elements from Souls because Souls kind of changed action games in the same way that every hack and slash takes something from DMC, right? Like, but you wouldn't necessarily say that every hack and slash was DMC, but because DMC like formulated its own genre that was so crucial to making action games even work fundamentally, every game ends up having something like DMC in it. And so um I do think that I do think it's very possible though that 17 would have Souls like elements. I think that would make a lot of sense, but I wouldn't think that they would lean heavily into being like super Souls-esque, right? Because one thing I don't understand about like, making like a Souls like Final Fantasy Origin, for example, Stranger of Paradise, like I don't think that game needed to look like that. I don't think that game should have looked like that. Um, I don't think the FF1's world should look like that. I thought that game was artistically, I thought that game was really ugly. I don't mean graphically. I mean artistically, I thought that game was really not good. Personally speaking. Like if we're talking about like character design and the style of graphics that they chose for that game, I was actually really disappointed uh, by the decisions that they made with that game artistically. That just really was not appealing at all. I think for this same budget or even less, they could have made that game have stylized graphics, which it should have anyway. Like an ultra realistic FF1, and it wasn't even ultra realistic. It was like butt ugly realism. It was like butt ugly realism, and yeah, it just was not. It just was not very good looking, and I just didn't imagine FF1's world like that. I think that like if you were gonna cell shade or like not even cell shade, but like have like stylized graphics for a Final Fantasy modern game, I think that like doing something in FF1's world would have been the appropriate time to do that. Aragami Sensei saying here, I think main FF will never be lower than AAA because they are afraid of damaging the IP. Remakes could be done better, but scaled down and done like Dragon Quest III Remake and not like high quality 7. That's a good point. Subtext, dude, thank you for the super chat, bro. Subtext says, what drives budget is confusing. What I've heard in exec interviews is that the biggest driver of cost is dev talent plus time plus cost uh is one half. Wow. Okay. So wait, tech cost. Wait, what is one out of two? Oh, you're giving two super chats. Oh, okay, my bad. Okay. So let me just read that over. Well, what drives budget is confusing. What I've heard in exec interviews is that the biggest driver of cost and dev plus time is dev time plus time and talent. As an example, Spider-Man 2 has probably 80 hours worth of less content than Rebirth, but had a $380 million budget, presumably larger. Not sure how. Okay, first, thank you for the super chats. Um, yeah, yeah, um, yeah. It is, right? It is pretty wild that like I mean, I think a lot of games have way more content than Spider-Man 2 and probably cost way less than Spider-Man 2 did. So, in some fairness, I don't know if every AAA game can be equated to what what Spider-Man 2 would. So, but it is ridiculous though that we need that many people to make a AAA game, right? I mean, most of the money does go toward um, the developers themselves, paying for the actual talent to make the game. That is where most of the money goes when we're not talking about the marketing, at least. And so, and even then, marketing still requires a tremendous amount of manpower as well. It, I don't think that you can't make these AAA games with less people. That's for sure, right? And so you do need a crap ton of people, unless you talk about scaling down some of the things that you need. Then you can scale down the size of these teams. And if you can scale down the size of teams, then you can have more teams working on more things, hypothetically. And that would be ideal. Hey, I have this idea in my head that FF can make a AA game that is live service. It can have free content updates like FF14 does with its patches, but paid cosmetics. I say live service because Square is trying to attract a larger audience, a large younger audience to FF, and live service is popular with audiences. In my head, it would kind of work like Monster Hunter or Destiny, but single player. Well, those are AAA releases, right? Monster Hunter and Destiny would be would be AAA. And what you're describing sounds like a Genshin Impact or a Wuthering Wave, and those games are also definitely AAA, despite their stylized graphics. However, principally, I don't agree with you that something like that should exist. And I think that Square kind of dropped the ball with it not being them, right? How much of that money is also spent on marketing? Well, that's a good question, Wabi Sabi. Marketing usually costs about as much as it does to develop the game or more. So it's not uncommon to hear a game costing $100 million to make and then them spending $100 million marketing it. That's not always the ratio. However, you will see that ratio come up pretty commonly, where the marketing is about as expensive, if not one for one, with the cost of the game's development, possibly more. Gosh, thank you for the tier 1. Subscribe for 53 months. What a king. Thank you so much. Square Enix already had a Monster Hunter like it was called FF15 Comrades. You know, Comrades was actually a really fun DLC. Like, actually, and it actually had a lot of content that came for it. So, um, Comrades was pretty cool. Like, I was definitely not down on Comrades. I thought that was a really neat DLC. Gosh, I'm doing great, man. How about you? Um, Now, where do I personally stand on this, right? I'll tell you guys. At first, my first initial reaction was Final Fantasy maybe should scale down to AA. And the reason I thought this was because I was looking at how insurmountable AAA looks like right now. How many units you have to sell, how the market for AAA games really isn't growing quite as exponentially in the way that you might imagine because, so many younger people will play only their live service game and nothing else, right? They won't play. I know people who play thousands of hours of Genshin and other games like that. And those people, if you ask them, they'll say like, no, no, no. Like I love AAA games. I love, big self-contained releases. I love paying for a finished complete product. In fact, a lot of them will even like, tell you in a very direct sense that they value that so much more than the thing that they've actually put thousands of hours and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars into, right? They almost have like this bitter relationship toward the free to play game that they've been, but they still put by far significantly more hours and significantly more dollars even into this thing that they kind of have a bitter relationship with. Um, and so, yeah. I mean, it says a lot. It says a lot, and it kind of spells out, like that we're having we that the industry that that pushes out these self-contained releases versus something like free to play games. It's all in a tight spot. With AAA games, however, they do have the potential to really reach a incredibly wide audience if they do well. Incredibly wide. Like, and they can make a huge impact. I mean, look at Zelda, right? Look at God of War, etc. And so I don't think that necessarily, as Final Fantasy is supposed to be their flagship title, it's supposed to be the game that they produce. I don't think that necessarily scaling it down, personally speaking, is maybe the right thing to do, because I think that if they do that, they kind of admit defeat in a way. There's a caveat to that. It might be time to admit defeat, right? It might be time to say we're not winning in the AAA space and we can't win, right? Like we done everything we can and we can't make this series take off, right? Um, I really don't know any other series that's like kind of stuck in FF situation. There might be some out there, but I really don't know any other series that's like Final Fantasy right now where basically the highest selling game was like over 25 years ago. How long did Final Fantasy 7 come out now? It's over 20. Is it like 26 years, 27 years? It's like 27 years, right? Cuz Crisis Core was for like the 25th anniversary. So, I actually don't know any other game series that has that issue. I can't name one personally. Um, for the most part, every other series has had a new benchmark title within the past decade or so that has sold more, right? Like Resident Evil, Resident Evil had that multiple times actually. Like 4 was like a huge benchmark, and then 5 sold even more than that. And then they plateaued at 5 for a really long time. And then we just found out that that Resident Evil 2 remake has sold the most of any Resident Evil game ever. All right. But even in the case of Resident Evil, though, Resident Evil's averages were climbing even then, right? Like, even though it's not like every Resident, like for example, right? Like Final Fantasy games now are not selling necessarily more than Final Fantasy games on PS1, right? Or like excluding 7, right? But like actually I don't even know if most actually no, most aren't selling as good as like Final Fantasy 8 even, I think. Most are selling a little bit below that. So, right, so that's a little bit of shrinkage actually. But if you compare to like Resident Evil, where Resident Evil 2 remake, I mean Resident Evil 2 original sold like I want to say 5 million. RE2 original at 5 million on its initial launch, and then RE4 remake selling 7 million in the first year, right? So, I mean, with Resident Evil, they've continued to have that growth. They've continued to make titles that, at the very least, when they're not breaking that sort of like huge sales benchmark, they are at least raising the averages for like what the series is selling, right? So like with FF, you would expect like, oh my God, we're doing like, we're not, even if we're not surpassing FF7 each game, we're at least doing like an average of like 10 million or something like consistently. But that hasn't happened. If anything, FF is actually going the other way. It's actually declining from entry to entry, right? It's actually, I think, actually, with the exception of Final Fantasy 15, it's kind of been on that slow decline. Why aren't you playing Final Fantasy 14 Dawn Trail Night? That's a good question. If I was playing Final Fantasy 14 Dawn Trail right now, I mean, I didn't want to play it right now because I feel like if I play it right now, then like no one would even watch if I did, right? Like, um, I wanted to give it some time so people can get ahead. And yeah, like my mods can't even moderate spoilers right now because they haven't even gotten there themselves. I also don't think it's possible to FF to be the best looking franchise anymore. The level of fidelity on PlayStation's first party games is insane, built on custom tech at a huge cost. That is also a great point, right? Like, um, especially like growing up, Final Fantasy was like the game visually. Like people talk about like Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10. Those games were visually impressive at the time, definitely so. But I think for me, like the most mind-blowing like Final Fantasy graphical experience was 10. I don't remember if you guys or like if you guys were there. Like if you were around at that time, you have to be like 30, over 30 now. But if you were around at that time and you saw Final Fantasy X for the first time on PlayStation 2, for me, that was like the most mind-blowing visual experience ever, dude. I don't think that anything will ever I'll never have that experience with like video game graphics ever again. Like the first time I saw Final Fantasy X, it was incredible. It was incredible. There's just nothing that even comes close to that experience. And I think actually too like the visual thing that like really stood out to me as a kid was kind of being on the boat um to Kilika, and like they had like the FMVs in the water that happened like while you were fighting the sin spawn. And I just remember like I was playing it, right? I was playing it and like my parents walked by, and my parents were like just like sucked into the game because they were like, "Holy shit, that's the coolest thing ever." When they were like, and my mom would play like Crash Bandicoot with me like growing up, and like Super Mario 64. So we play games like that together, right? But like my dad didn't play any games. Um so like them just walking by was like really cool. I also had that experience with like Final Fantasy 8. Now I actually played Final Fantasy 8 a lot later in life. Not like too much later, but I think I was in like high school, like when I first played FF8. So I was actually like going backward. And it's actually really funny because I remember playing FF8 and my dad like walks by the screen, and it was like it's doing like an Ifrit summon animation. And video games had already progressed at this point to a pretty decent like plays. Like PS3 was already out. But he had saw FF8 summon animations because he doesn't pay attention to video games, and he still thought that that was like visually that was the coolest thing ever. He was like, "Oh shit, that's so cool." That's such a neat animation, right? And I'm just thinking that like he was marveled by that PS1 game at that time, and I'm like, I'm thinking in my head he hasn't even seen the trailer for Final Fantasy 13 at that time. So I was like, he doesn't even know like how cool video games are now and how like realistic the graphics are. We should be taken seriously because you can see all the hairs in the characters' heads. Oh man. Yeah. So, but that is something like that's an experience I do kind of feel sad for like with the younger generation. I think they're never going to have like an experience. Maybe some people in Gen Z will have that experience, but or have had that experience, but I don't think anyone in Gen Alpha is ever going to have the experience of like, oh my God, these are the coolest, most mind-blowing graphics. Like I don't know if, and I could be wrong, right? Like maybe we'll all have that experience when AI powered virtual reality is real and it can mimic reality to like to like this perfect insane degree, and we'll all have this like experience where we're like inside of like Ready Player One. Like I don't know, maybe something like that, right? Maybe that will happen. But in terms of traditional video games in the way they are now, I don't think they'll ever have that experience where their minds are just completely obliterated by by how cool that leap in tech is, right? Like how like advanced. And to a certain extent, I don't think I've had that experience in a long time in general. Not just with graphics, but like it's been a while since there's been a leap in technology that's genuinely like kind of impressed me. I think the closest thing that we've really come to that's really made me feel that way is some generative AI stuff, right? Like where I'm like, oh, holy shit, this opens up a ton of possibility and changes everything, right? Like, like a chat GPT or something like that. But anything else, like, no, I don't think I've really had quite that experience where it's just been like, dude, this just changes like everything. So we haven't really had those kind of tech leaps in a really long time. Another thing too with pushing that boundary of graphics, it's not like we don't have better hardware, right? Like we're increasingly making like better hardware each time. Jay the Uncreator, hello. Hi NSP. I hope you're having a great day. I am. I didn't know you were streaming, so when I saw that you were, I clicked on it immediately. If you want an answer to your stream title, then my answer is no. Okay. I'll run a poll in a bit. Actually, if there is some people who really want to make their case on scaling down, I would really appreciate if they did it. But also too, people who are like, no, it should never scale down. So if anyone has a thesis to write, I'd really appreciate if you go ahead and write it, and I'll read some of your thesis out loud and give my thoughts on it, and let people in the chat for respond to these. By the way, how are you guys liking these so far? This is only the second one that we've done like this, where we just have like a community chat where we shoot the shit on these types of topics and um, just kind of enjoy it. But like, yeah, I'm liking them too. Okay, I'm glad you guys like them. I like them too. I think so far they've been like really respectful. No one's really been like, no one's been a dick about it. So everyone's kind of like been stating their case. And I feel like I have room to state what I believe, and everyone else has been stating it. And of course, you can disagree with whatever the hell I'm saying too. And I think everyone's been really good. So I really hope that we can keep doing these uh and keep having these very productive discussions, because that's all I want here. It's just for everyone to be able to say something without someone butting in and being like, weird take, bro. I have not. I've seen a lot of maybe disagreeable opinions, but I don't think anyone has had a genuine take that I think is like is like weird. Um, Listening to you talk while playing Star Ocean 2 remake. Oh, that's awesome. Um, so I mean, with double A, I will say that or if they were to scale down anything, the thing that I would scale down is the graphics. And I'll make my case here while anyone else is making their case about what they think. But I do think that if there is anything to scale down, I do think it is the graphics. I don't think that, you know, I don't know if, how should I say this? I think that people are a lot more open to stylized games now and stylized art than they were in previous generations, to a large degree. And I think the thing you can thank for that is the influence of anime, right? But I don't think that Final Fantasy should look like Tails. I'm not saying Tails is ugly or undesirable in any way. I just don't think Final Fantasy should straight up look like a Tails game or like a Persona game. I don't think that's like what Final Fantasy should do. I think that whatever FF should do should have a very unique art style that is very not hyper realism, but also not necessarily just anime, right? I think an example, not necessarily like what I mean exactly, but an example of what I mean could be something like Kingdom Hearts, for example, where Kingdom Hearts does not necessarily have a straight generic anime art style. Not saying that Persona or Tales is generic, but it sticks a little bit closer to maybe the more modern anime aesthetics that you might find. Um, but I think that if we're gonna have a main line that scales down graphics, then I think it should have an art style that like is something that you look at and it doesn't really necessarily look quite like any other cell shaded anime game. I feel like Rebirth is the highest amount of graphics fidelity we should go because it looks nice, but if you look around, it is not a Sony AAA. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, it's always one thing that I liked about like Kingdom Hearts quite a bit too, is that I thought like Kingdom Hearts 2, for example, on PS2 was like the peak of aesthetic. I don't think a video game has ever looked better than KH2. Uh, personally speaking, that was the height of video game graphics. I love something. It's also why, and this might be a hot take. This is definitely a hot take. Um, but I prefer Dark Cloud. I think those of you in Europe, I think y'all called it Dark Chronicle. But I prefer Dark Cloud 1 to 2. A lot of that preference is predicated on not liking the art style of 2 as much as I like the one in 1. Like I thought Dark Cloud 1 had a better art style than Dark Cloud 2. They're gonna beat my ass for saying. But I did think the Dark Cloud 1 had a better art style. I don't think we plateaued graphics necessarily. I also don't think I really have the need for hyperrealism in games personally. I've always preferred stylized graphics over realistic since it tends to age much better, like Dragon Quest VIII, for example. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The reason I say they should scale down side content too is because not everyone does side content to begin with. Most side content in games aren't usually good anyway. Oh, that might be a hot take, like not even one that I necessarily disagree with either, because I do kind of agree that games with side content that I enjoy are kind of the minority compared to games with like side content that is just like at best okay, right? Like there's a couple of games with side content that is like really really good as it can be. But yeah, there's a lot of games that have side content that I'm just like, this is here to be here. But side content is optional. The point Panda Eyes, or the point that Kino was making in the Twitch chat, was not that it's optional. Yes, you as the player have the option to do it or not do it. What he's referring to is the fact that the developer doesn't have the option to make it or not make it. Because if they're making it, or rather, if they are making it, then they have to spend the money making it. And so, if we're talking about scaling stuff down, then he would say that, like, maybe scaling down the amount of side content is like is something that could be done um to maybe keep costs in line. But then I also don't know if that's necessarily true, because a lot of side content isn't isn't necessarily expensive to make. Like a lot of Final Fantasy 16's side content was literally like go talk to a guy and then go defeat a mob that you've already fought. Um, so that, I mean, it may not have been that expensive. Probably the most I mean, that and like a lot of FF16 side quests were like literally like two robots talking to each other. Like in terms of animation, where it was like a fixed camera angle and like minimal animations. It was very the side quests in that game were almost entirely carried by good voice acting. Like if we didn't have Ben Starr in that game, oof, we would have been it would have been very rough. So I'm very glad that we had him because I think he carries. I think he ended up doing a lot of the heavy lifting, especially in like making those uh side quests like really entertaining and engaging because from like an animation and like a camera work perspective, they were dry. They were dry. And that and also too the fact that kind of a common CVU3 problem where characters talk too long about things they could have said in like 3 sentences. They say it in like 15 or 18 sentences and I'm just like, "Oh boy. Dialogue on dialogue." Um I mean, and that's not just a problem with 16 again. That's like a problem with CVU3 period because 14 also has that issue. Um, but and it's not just reusing assets when it comes to side quests. I mean, paying for I mostly mean pay. Yeah, you do have to pay for more voice work. That too, right? I think that's the only thing that people don't want to see scale down, or the thing that people hate about scaling down is that no one wants less voice work, right? I know that there are some people that are like, oh, I don't mind reading some stuff. Listen, I give you the perfect example of how much voice work makes a difference is like Persona 3 Reload, right? Persona 3 Reload, you're going through that and like now like all the social links and everything is voice. The game is almost full voice. It's not quite full voice, like there is some small stuff that's not. But like because of that though, I find social links to be so much more fun in Persona 3 Reload than they have ever been in the Persona series because like even in Persona 5, you're like you're just like reading all of it and it sucks because a lot of those scenes would have been incredible voiced over. Voice work is the cheapest part. Yeah, I think voice work is probably the cheapest part of all that because when you get into the actual game design of making the side quests and all the other stuff, right? Um, the most expensive part of a video game by far is the graphics. Like graphics are always the biggest expense made. Almost everything goes into making graphics, and so realistically, when we talk about scaling down, what we really mean is scaling down graphics, right? Like you can cut down on content, but I feel like then if you're cutting down on content, then you're just making a worse game at some point. Not necessarily, because you guys know how I feel about shorter games, and I'm a big believer in making games shorter and concise and to the point, such that the player is able to get to the content that's actually enjoyable about the game, and not just doing mindless busy work so that they could, they can hit a certain number of hours in the game. But man, graphics are the vast majority of any budget. They're the vast majority of dev time. Making good graphics, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. A lot of stuff gets outsourced. Uh, it's why video games keep getting more expensive more than anything. I get the notion of less side content, but I feel that players who don't like side content are very vocal and loud about it and want FF games to be bare bones with story only. Option is no, I don't disagree. I don't think most people disagree, right? Like, um, outside of internet discourse, I don't think that there should necessarily be less side content though. I just feel like side content should be good. And if less side content is one way to achieve that, then I'm fine with it. But I don't think that like Final Fantasy games have had like really tremendously great side content. And well, I think Rebirth had like some really good side content. It also had some like less than stellar side content too. But that's because the volume of that game was so ridiculous that of course it had things that were incredible and things that weren't. Because the volume of that game was just so utterly ridiculous. Um, Physics and tools too, at least for studios like Rockstar, they cost a lot. Yeah. But even then, I don't think that like for the most part it even comes close to the production of graphics. It's the most expensive and complicated part of game dev by far. Only just log off FF14. I do nearly 6K hours on PC. When the PS5 is messing with me. Hello, Crossy. How are you doing? Glad to have you here. How was Dawn Trail, by the way? I still think Rebirth is up there with Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate as the best game of the generation. I don't disagree one bit. I don't disagree one bit. I think that Rebirth is a top tier RPG that can be compared and sat next to a lot of current gen top tier RPGs. But I don't think that, I mean, Rebirth being what it is kind of locks a lot of people out of it. And so, you know, it's tough because people just can't go pick up Rebirth, right? You would tell them, oh, you need to go play Remake. And having that barrier there of, oh, you need to go do this thing first. That's really tough for people. That's really tough because nobody wants to just go do that other thing first. People just want to hop into the thing that's interesting and great, right? They don't want to wait for the other thing. And so video games kind of have a challenge that films and TV series don't have, right? And part of that challenge also too, aside from the fact that like a TV series or film series just takes significantly less time and investment, is that I can do it with everyone, right? Like you can catch up on a TV series with like partner, for example, right? Like if someone says, "Oh my God, season three of this show is the most insane thing I've ever seen," right? Well, we can go and spend an hour each night watching an episode, get caught up. You can basically sit there brain dead, force feeds into you, right? And you'll get the story, you'll understand, and you'll be like, "Oh, okay, I get it now," right? But you can't really do that with video games where because first of all there's an inherent skill threshold where um like for example there's a lot of people that can't play video games at all, not because they physically can't but because they just don't know how, or they didn't grow up with them, right? So I couldn't for example maybe spend time with my partner doing that. So there's all types of challenges like that that come about when it comes to catching up. And so Final Fantasy VII has this issue where, yeah, or at least Rebirth in particular has this issue where you need to play the remake first. And then on top of needing to play the remake first, people are like, oh, you really need to play the OG first so that you can actually get all of it, right? That's difficult to do. That's a lot to ask for a lot of people. Um, Crossy says Dawn Trail is good so far. I'm not really noticing the graphics overhaul. Like, I know it's there, but I really don't notice it when playing, if that makes sense. But just spend time acclimating to controller. It's tough after all the hours on mouse and keyboard. Um, I went around in Final Fantasy 14 just checking the graphics, and I do notice the graphics update. It's not overwhelming, at least in the post or pre-Dawn Trail areas. But I do notice, in particular, if I zoom in on my character, the finer details of armor and stuff like that, the textures are better. If I look at ground textures are better. In particular, vegetation is a lot better too. I don't really see as many busted looking low resolution textures as I used to going around the game. There's a lot of textures in the original version of the game that um, just were pretty awful. So you're saying the remake recap video in Rebirth isn't enough? There was a rumor before Rebirth came out that there was going to be a 17-minute uh that there was going to be a 17-minute CGI video that was going to recap Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I was like, "Oh my God, please let this be true," because if they did like a 17-minute um a 17-minute viral like short film about the first game that kind of like ran everyone through like what happened, I was like, that would be so good and it'd be so cool to watch and everyone would watch it because it'd be something brand new. And that didn't happen. That would have been really expensive to make, of course, if they had made like a CG short film that essentially, recapped all those events. But if they were able to do that, then that would have been really cool. That was a rumor at the time that didn't end up being true. If that was true, it would have been awesome. But that did not happen. Kino says, by the way, no, I don't want FF to be bare bones at all. I just think that side quests don't need to make up most of the meat on those bones. You can still have good puzzles and exploration for sure, but fetch quests, etc., still feel like a waste of time, if not money. Um, yeah, yeah. I kind of feel that way with like all filler content, right? Like if it's not like really contributing to the game, then I just kind of don't want to do it, and I feel like the devs shouldn't want to make it. But there's a lot of metrics to be hit. We need this many quests and this many hours, and so the recap video wasn't enough because some players forgot or didn't know about the ending with the Whisper, so I saw some people confused by Zack's appearance and seeing two sets of characters. Yeah, this is something, and I've talked about this before with Rebirth, but it's impossible to know if Rebirth's or the Re-Trilogy story, had a negative impact on sales or not, or if it even had a positive impact in some way. But I think what can be said is that it's not conducive for an audience that just wants to get directly into Rebirth, right? Like it is not tailor-made for people being able to hop in and enjoy it. Enjoying it to the fullest requires homework on some level if you are brand new to the series. You aren't able to just go into that experience and sort of get the full picture. Which is why, well, I guess that's not even actually the thing anymore. Actually, Rebirth was kind of weird in the sense that I feel it makes me really feel like I actually don't know where this thing is going anymore. I guess let me explain what I mean by that. Because before, at the end of Remake, there was a lot of certainty around the sequel nature of this, right? And so because of that, it was like, okay, well, this is going to be some type of like pseudo sequel. It's going to have these sequel elements in it, and we're going to be able to like, um, we're going to lean into like all these new events and all these new things happening. And new things definitely do happen in Rebirth, but they're mostly packed toward the end and like kind of somewhat sprinkled out throughout the middle. But like the actual new tremendous deviations are mostly things that happen in like the last 10% of the game, the last two chapters. Because for the most part, it's not that different. It's the same. But it's weird though too because the first game and everything that's happening in this game, it feels like they're building up for something different in a major way. But then the different thing doesn't happen. And so this is where people who are very much like, FF7R is a remake will hop in and clip this and be like, aha, NSP, that's because it is a remake. And you missed the fact that it was a remake because you and your theory bros wanted it to be a sequel. Yes, this is like some of the deranged shit that people say to me. Um, and I'm just like, it's always deranged. I'm just like, dude, sequel theory bros wanting it to be a sequel. I'm just like, I'm just trying to make like reasonable predictions based on like what the game is trying to do. And I know the devs say that, oh yeah, it's still a remake. We just put that in there for some twists. I guess that's what they did, right? But at the same time, those twists are kind of like not doing a tremendous amount. I want them to do stuff. I do. I kind of don't want it to like not do stuff. Like it needs to do something. Because otherwise, why add in like dimensional ghosts that protect the timeline from deviations if they do in fact end up protecting the timelines from the said deviations and none of the deviations actually really happen and everything stays the same. It's like making part of the story about like not spilling the milk and then no one spills the milk. Well, then I'd be like, well, then where's the conflict? What's the point? Like, where are we going? Right? Like, I don't know. That was weird to me. The fact that they think you wanted it to be anything other than a remake is crazy. You only called it a sequel because that was your interpretation. It's not that complex. Yeah, I know Keto, but like, yeah, that's what they had hit me with at the time. And I was like, what are you talking about? I think, and by the way, I was kind of like, I wasn't like even anti FF7 2 either, but I do think that like the thing with doing FF7 2 is that like that would be so inaccessible for new people, right? And I think that an FF7 reboot of any kind should have been more about an FF7 reboot of any kind, remake of any kind. I feel like should have been more about like my nephew than me, if that makes sense. Like, of course, it's about me, but but I feel like it should have been more about him. I don't know if that makes sense. But I feel like it's more about me and my generation that like grew up watching like Linkin Park AMVs to Advent Children and such. Um, I mean, in part one, it helped make events make more sense and make the PS1 timing less awkward, like in real life. Why couldn't they stop Reno from pressing the button to drop the plate? Well, okay, so I feel like that could have been addressed by like just writing the scene differently, and not necessarily just like writing the time ghost to like make it so that he hesitates. Maybe he could have just hesitated because he was just like, wait a second, I'm about to kill like thousands of people. I probably shouldn't do that. I think that would have been good and maybe humanized him a bit more. So I don't necessarily agree per se. What annoys me about Retrilogy so far is it's just more compilation. The biggest issue I have, and plenty that I have, the biggest issue I and plenty of others have with the compilation is the constant circle jerking of Sephiroth, making him into something he wasn't in OG. He is so far removed from the aspects of him I like in OG. I don't want the FF7 obsessed fanboy idealized version of Sephiroth. I want that shark in the water he feels like in OG Riot. I think he's just too powerful now. Like I don't understand like what I just don't understand. I don't know. It's kind of hard to draw that line. Um, but yeah, Sephiroth is he's he's something now. He honestly doesn't need any more power. Yeah, I feel like he's already a god in Retrilogy to the point of where I'm like, why are you trying all this live stream business? Like, why are you trying to, you know, do the same plan that you had, or maybe not the same plan, but something similar where you want the live stream and everything? I'm like, dude, you're already like this interdimensional being now. Like, how much more God can you be? Right? Like, you are already like you're already like a god, right? So I don't understand like how much more God. I don't know but Sony Santa Monica got it right with God of War 2018 being a sequel. Maybe because God of War wasn't a big narrative franchise before, and that the Norse era takes time way after. Plus, God of War 2018 has a main story that is a bigger one when Rebirth is like a season two, with video games doing that is hard. That does make sense. I think that like a lot of what the reason God of War 2018 really worked in that way is that with God of War 2018, you kind of only needed to know about the idea of Kratos and not any of the actual lore, like in a deep, profound way. You didn't need to know anything about most of the stuff that happened in the Greek saga. If you did, it made everything better. However, it wasn't deeply necessary. You needed to know who Kratos was as a character, but even then, you didn't need to know every sin he committed, just that he did a lot of them. Dude McGuy, hello. Not too powerful so much as they've written Sephiroth so he's unthreatening and tried to compensate showing off his power level in cutscenes as if that undoes the fact that we whoop his ass again. I mean that's also a thing too, is that like it does get kind of hard to feel threatened by a guy that you've beaten multiple times, right? It's not like I'll give you an example. Actually, like maybe a very suitable example. I think that like let's take Homelander for example. If you guys like watch The Boys. So we have Homelander, right? Homelander is such a good villain, and part of what makes Homelander a great villain is that every time Homelander is on screen, you kind of have your cheeks clenched because you never know when Homelander is going to snap and kill everyone. And it's really scary and it's really unsettling, and you're hoping the best for the characters. But part of that is that Homelander has never been humbled, right? You can't beat Homelander. No one has power over Homelander. It's like an ant going up against against a human being. Even when there's thousands of ants, he's still going to crush all of us, right? And so there is that sense of helplessness that he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and we can't stop him. But imagine if at the end of every season of The Boys, they beat Homelander up. Right? And I know people will say, that's like, oh, well, in that case, Sephiroth was just toying with them. He wasn't using his real power. But that doesn't really take from the fact that, like, well, then what is he doing? Why are we even fighting him if he's just toying with us? Like, why is that why is the final boss, like, being, like, toyed with? So, if we beat Homelander's ass at the end of every season of The Boys, Homelander would not have the same sort of, you know, menacing nature that he does. And, like, that's kind of the problem that we have with, like, Sephiroth. Think them going for the rivalry aspect after the compilation is a good idea. Um, Actually, I'm not sure what you mean. Can you elaborate for me, bro? Um, I just didn't want to misinterpret what you mean. Crossy says, yes, he is too powerful. Thank you. Now this will ruffle feathers of the power scalers, but FF7 characters in power at play in the original game was always on the lower end of FF games. If magical, super soldier, and aliens, but now Sephiroth is dimension hopping D&D with Cloud just because. I mean, that was actually something that I really liked about it, was that it was a little bit more grounded. But I actually think that, like, being grounded is, like, what I really liked about 7 in general, is that it wasn't like that. I actually really liked. Can we all agree that the overuse and willingness to overuse the toying with them and not using full power trope is trite and well past being interested at all? I think if you grew up with anime, yeah. I think if you grew up with anime, especially, the just toying with them, not using the full power is like it does get there. In FF6, if you defeat Kefka early on, but then the story reestablished him as a much more powerful threat about 60% through. Sephiroth is already stronger from Shinra at the start, but we haven't seen him really grow beyond that at all. Yeah. Jazzy, thank you so much for the super chat. In OG, he talks about traveling the live stream and creating his version of the future. Explain why any of Sephiroth's plans are shocking. He is like Voldemort, afraid of death. It seems simple. Um, I agree. I think the way I've always interpreted him is that he was like a kind of like a representation of ego. Um, Ego in like the maybe like the Eastern spirituality sense, whereas the live stream itself was kind of like enlightenment, oneness with all things. And so Sephiroth always kind of represented this uh need to be separate from the greater whole, right? And so even like when he's in like basically within the live stream where everyone's ego does in fact dissolve and they no longer become an individual person, Sephiroth like holds on to ego essentially, um, and sense of self and separate from the greater whole, and that allows him to continue to persist, right? And I always thought that the idea that like um him using Cloud in order to do that was always really cool. Um, because he almost needs someone else to help give him identity. So I've always thought that was like kind of the aspects of him that I really liked. If Sephiroth was a Western style myth, he'd be a vampire or something, taking the life of others to grow his own power. That makes a lot of sense. I kind of like that interpretation. Um, you thought Barnabas was a better villain than Sephiroth? Okay, I have to push back on that one. I don't think Barnabas is a better villain than Sephiroth. I actually think in general that 16. I think one thing that modern FF actually has done really well is that modern FF like consistently has pretty good villains. And I don't think that that was true of 16, if I'm honest. I think 16 had like some of the weakest. I think it like peaked at like Hugo. Hugo was like definitely the best antagonist in 16, and then it kind of nosedived out from there. But I think compared to Arden or Caius or Emmett Silk, um, that 16's villains were kind of like not really it for the most part. Ultima in particular was not. And it's actually funny because I think Barnabas was more interesting than Ultima, but Ultima was just not interesting. Ultima was not interesting to me at all. Um, which I know that a lot of people will talk about like the thematic connections of Ultima and stuff like that, but I think Ultima was like just like JRPG boss. Like now don't get me wrong, that's not to say everything about Ultima was like necessarily bad. I actually think that his design was really creepy and interesting. His voice and the actor who was voicing Ultima was really cool and actually made him kind of like really unsettling. He is the most disturbing thing to look at in probably the entire series, which is pretty cool. He looks like a thing out of like Resident Evil or some shit. Um, but like in terms of like actually being an actual character, an actual yeah. Ultima was basically Necron, but with more of a presence. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel too. He's been turned. Cloud Strife says he's been turned into a rival of sorts for Cloud and Aerith. Like you said, he keeps coming back. And it makes him stale in terms of, oh man, this guy is making me shit bricks. However, in terms of being a clash of ideals, um, what they stand for, he's good. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that, and that's definitely what I think that they want to go for in this, and as opposed to the mystery. And I think part of the reason that they do want to go for that is because they feel like they can't replicate that mystery, so that's what they're doing instead. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I have a general rule of thumb when it comes to villain writing. If your motives are that simple and lack depth, you have to at least be entertaining. Kefka, right? Because Kefka's motives are fucking simple. But Kefka was pretty interesting, right? He's entertaining. I think that like, but then you have villains like Emmett Selk or Arden, right? My internet died. Did you talk about my message? Yes, I did. TLDR. I said I think you made a lot of sense and a pretty good point. Um, if you want to see the VA for Ultima play another unsettling alien, oh, he voices aliens often. Highly recommend watching the modern revival of Doctor Who series, 3 episodes, Human Nature and Family of Blood. Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that he voiced more aliens. But yeah, his voice acting was really good. The presentation, the design of Ultima in general was like really cool. But like, and thematically, Ultima makes sense, right? Like, um, in a story where you're talking about slavery, for example, and um, you know, how religion has been used to justify it, and sort of the connection between man's slaves and a man's slavery to God and those sorts of things. It did make a lot of sense, but it was just never it was never it was never gripping for me. It was never like the point where I was like, "Oh my god, this is like such a fascinating tale." It was kind of just like yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but I don't care. um, that's kind of where it landed for me. So it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't completely unfitting for the story or anything like that. Like when I talk about like Ultima, like criticisms around Ultima as a villain, like um, it just wasn't like it just wasn't something that was gripping enough, or something that I found so profoundly different or so profoundly unique that like I really was like, this is like the peak of storytelling and such. If you want the honest truth about Ultimate 16, ignoring thematics, etc., just them as a villain on a basic level, they are Ultima from FF Tactics. All of FF16 is tactic stuff recontextualized. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, CPU3 kind of does that a lot, right? Take older FF stuff and like put a new spin on it and be like, ah. Annabella was the most disappointing character of 16 IMO. After playing that demo, I thought she was going to be one of the best villains in the franchise. She barely was in it. Yeah. I mean, I thought that like Joshua and Jill would have probably like done a little bit more than they did, but yeah, I felt like Joshua and Jill both didn't get like what they needed, but Jill in particular just didn't get what she needed. Um, it's a shame too, because I felt like there was so much potential with her. Like there was so much that could have happened with her, which is weird because the Scions absolutely do get their shine in FF14. So maybe it's because with FF14 again they had time to kind of adapt to the feedback. And so they were like, oh, people really like this, right? Like if Final Fantasy 16 was an ongoing thing, then I'm sure in like Final Fantasy 16 2, we would have gotten, or Final Fantasy 16 expansion, we would have gotten like a ton of Jill stuff or playable Jill and like all this other stuff, right? So, it's kind of hard to say. It's also hard because you also have to think that like Final Fantasy 16 began like around like Heavensward, right? And so CBU3 was at that time still kind of coming into their own in terms of what people liked about their stories and what made 14 good. Again, I feel like if Final Fantasy 16 began development 3 years before the exact period that it did, it probably would have been a very different video game in a lot of regards. Um, like I think it would have been like a lot. I and this goes back to like what we were talking about earlier, like when we were talking about like 17 being a Souls like. But I think it would have had maybe some Souls-ish elements in combat, maybe. because I think that those have taken off and been more popular. But I also think too that if it was developed after like Shadowbringers, for example, like or if it started development after Shadowbringers reception, I think that like for example, it would have been like a little bit different. Like it might have been like more party based and stuff like that, seeing how people reacted to the Scions and stuff like that. Right? Like I think 16 is just the result of starting development at the time that it did, which really puts into perspective how bad dev times have got. Yeah, because it started in like 2015, right? Like that's when they started planning this game. And, you know, in 2015, that was like when did hold on, let me see something before I make a statement. Okay, right. So in like 2015 we had like Bloodborne and stuff coming out, right? And so there was already kind of like a shift in like the types of action combat that would be popular. And so I don't know. I know there are some people that would hate that take, but I do feel like the combat would be different if that game was made at like a different like slightly ahead of like by a couple years. Like if the planning began. Because I can see them in like 2015 thinking that like doing something more like DMC would be a better move at that time. But I don't necessarily think it would be the move that would be made right now in 2024 based on the games that are popular. Didn't Yoshi P said he wanted to make a game like Bloodborne at some point? So apparently he said that he was already making a game like Bloodborne, and then it got canceled because he had to make a Realm Reborn. Um, and then when he saw Bloodborne, he was like, "That's exactly like the game I was trying to make." So right. Well, so well here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. Um, Hack and slash and RPG combat are almost eh, like philosophically opposed to each other, right? Like and like in like a pure state, action combat is about being like stylish, right? Like something like DMC hack and slash is about being stylish. It's about player expression. Um, this sky is the limit. There is no correct answer to a boss fight. You should be able to fight things the way you want to fight. Those types of things are the exact opposite of an RPG, right? Like in an RPG, fights are almost like puzzle solving, right? Like based on how many resources you have and what your skills and levels can do, how can I figure out how to kill this boss, right? Like that's what are the elemental weaknesses of this boss? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What buffs and debuffs can I use? That's the way RPGs work. And when you're making an action RPG, it already kind of gets difficult, right? Because on one hand, you want to reward the player for mechanical skill and try not to punish them for not being sufficiently leveled as long as their mechanical skill is good enough, right? But you don't want to lean all the way into the player just having mechanical skill because then it would ask, what's the point of the RPG have? But you don't want to lean all the way into being an RPG because then you can just one shot everything and the player will ask, well, the action game mechanics aren't satisfying. So why are we leaning, all the way into being an action game if you could have just been a turn-based game, right? So there, you know, it's already tough. It's already tough. Do you think FF16 started after remakes launched, the combat would be different. Oh, 100%. 100%. I think it definitely would have made an influence. Um Crossy, I don't think you necessarily like got like what I meant by that fully. So let me clarify. Frosty says the earliest examples of Japanese style RPGs are Action Combat, Dragon Slayer, Xanadu, etc. What I meant was not that they weren't, but I'm just saying that like it it already is like from a design standpoint a challenge to make a game that is balanced between its RPG elements and its action elements. And to some degree, you'll find with most hybrids that they lean, even if it's just 5 or 10%, a little bit more in one direction, right? Not that they haven't always existed, um, and not that they won't continue to exist. And it's just to say that, like, the compromise will always be a design challenge between how much action game should the action RPG be and how much RPG should the action RPG be. Right? If that makes sense. Um, right. Um, I think 16 would have benefited from a slower Souls-like, if you will, combat system, especially considering the time. I would have preferred something like slower and heavier like that, personally. I am into that, but yeah. I know a lot of people that would disagree, but I agree with you though. I would have preferred like a slower, heavier, weightier. I think actually too. As I've gotten like older, even I've kind of preferred like slower, heavier uh combat to like less weighted combat. I think actually Stellar Blade was like a really good balance because I feel like Stellar Blade was super fast and responsive, but it was kind of heavy at the same time too. Like you could not like jump all over the fucking place and like do like insane combos like nonstop. I mean, you could do some pretty insane combos, but like not like in like a pure hack and slash way. I felt like that was like really really cool. Um, Hino says that's why I think most action RPGs should ban leveling systems unless they are party based. I don't mind level gating though, or losing levels when party members die. That's a hot take. That's a hot take. So you mean like well, if an action RPG doesn't have leveling, then how would it how would it I mean, what's the progression system like in place of that? Crossy chimes in on that, saying, "Funny enough, the ease games you hit max level like a third of the way into the game. The rest of the game is just about learning mechanics and finding the appropriate gear." Right. So see, that would be like leaning heavier into being an action game, right? With light RPG elements. But that's what I mean, though, right? Like, it's really hard for to design a game that is truly 50% action and truly 50% RPG. Typically, it is always going to be like, well, actually, like, you really look at the game design, it'll be like, well, it's really like 60% RPG and like 40% action, or it's really like 70% action and like 40%. Um, so it's always a little bit one more than the other. And part of that is because just the design philosophy of action games and design philosophy of what makes an RPG, right? There are other RPGs elements to add other than leveling systems like status elements, elemental weaknesses, or even gear based like God of War Ragnarok. Yeah, that's why God of War Ragnarok is like one of my favorite JRPGs. I say that, but like all the kind of like expectations that people have of like of like a lot of JRPGs, Ragnarok kind of has them, except for like literal leveling up. But technically, Ragnarok does have more RPG elements in it than say FF16. That was a article that IGN ran when they said that God of War Ragnarok is more RPG than 16. And personally, I don't disagree with that. Del Walker on the YouTube chat says, "Do you want them to scale down FFs?" That's a good question. I don't think they can. I think it was talked about a lot, given a lot of the news that happened last month. But as I really thought about it, I don't know if there is a way to make FF not AAA. Like, I know that will confuse some people because they'll be like, what the fuck do you mean? There's definitely a way to make it not AAA. You're right. But I mean, as the flagship of Square Enix, you know, it it would kind of be troubling if they did. Now they could scale down graphics. They could go with maybe stylized graphics. Stylized graphics can still be expensive. I assure you that the money spent on Kingdom Hearts 3's graphics were still very pricey, probably as much of it as FF7R's. So yeah, so it's not like anime equal cheap, realism equal all like super expensive necessarily all the time, but like generally speaking, anime is a lot cheaper. Yeah, that's true. It just depends on what kind of style. Final Fantasy has always been a AAA title. That's the main selling point. Yeah, at least since 7, I would say. 7 through 16 have always been um have been AAA. Wouldn't Crisis Core Union graphics pass as triple? I mean, Crisis Core Union utilized assets from Final Fantasy VII Remake's main game. So even though Crisis Core Union is not a AAA game, Crisis Core Union's graphics are AAA because it's just straight up taking assets from the main game. So, would you say that what was considered AAA 10 years ago is AA by today's standards? Um, I think well, Near Replicant was always AA. So, um, yeah, but to an extent, I don't know. I don't think I would consider FF13 AA ever. That is like definitively AAA. Like if FF13 ever becomes AA, then like Uncharted 2 is also double. That's a very expensive game and very graphically intensive and has like a full film's worth of CGI animated cutscenes. So, for example, Sekiro doesn't have a leveling system, and yet it won Game of the Year despite. Well, Sekiro is not an RPG, if I'm not mistaken. It's not like labeled as an RPG. Let me make sure of that. But it's like one of the only FromSoft games that's not an RPG. Yeah, yeah, it's officially labeled as an action adventure. Actually, that's what makes Sekiro probably the hardest FromSoft game, right? You can't go get a cheese build in Sekiro. Not really. There's not, or that I know of. There's not that many cheese builds that you can go get in Sekiro. And that's what makes Sekiro balls fucking hard. Is because, you can't just go do all that typical stuff and like, oh, now I've cleared like, the whole screen. Nope. You have to get good. Arguably, AAA 10 years ago is AA now if we look at the cost alone, as really that was what all AAA ever meant, how expensive the game was because it used money, because it used to mean money was quality. That is far from true now, right? The problem is that RPG has become too broad of a term. Just changing an armor piece will get a game labeled as an RPG. I'm so glad you said that. I actually wrote an entire I wrote an entire video on this and I never fucking recorded it. Now you guys are making me want to record it. Originally it was titled, and I might still publish this with this title if I ever do record it. But I made a video titled How Everything Became an RPG. And it was a very long essay, and I'm feeling like I should go back and actually finish that now. Essentially, what I was saying was that, I mean, it's exactly your point, right? Like, what is an RPG now? RPG is almost like to an extent, it's like a meaningless genre qualifier. It doesn't mean anything. It's an RPG. Saying your game is an RPG tells me fucking nothing about the game. It's like the most meaningless qualifier ever now. Because you could say something's an RPG and it'd be a shooter, right? Like Cyberpunk. You could say something's an RPG and it'd be like Baldur's Gate, right? You can say something is an RPG and it'd be a hack and slash like Final Fantasy 16. What does RPG even fucking mean? What does it mean? Like what does it actually mean? RPG is just a vibe. It's not a specific thing anymore. Like at all. It's not a specific thing. And I say anymore, but like was it ever like a specific thing? Right? Like massive, like yeah, that's right. Like Mass Effect and like Final Fantasy 16 and like Baldur's Gate and like and Cyberpunk and The Witcher and Persona are all in the same genre. You know? So, I mean, all RPG kind of means nowadays, or again, maybe always, is just kind of like a vague concept of stats are probably going to be important. All right? Like there's going to be some type of number bullshit that's happening in the game. And vaguely that's all you may make some choices about like what it's going to be. But other than that, RPG doesn't really mean much nowadays, or in general, I guess. But uh, if you really want to like go deep into it, RPG kind of like I mean, all of RPGs really stem from tabletop and from uh, Dungeons and Dragons, and so my definition of RPG is letting the player build each party member however you want. I mean, that's kind of how I personally would define RPG, right? Is by the bare minimum is that I think you need to be able to build at least a character in the way in which you want, right? NSP, how old are you? How old do I look? Just curious. Got to be under 30. Based. So true, King. Let's fucking go. Let's go. Let's go. I love it. But then by that definition, DQ1 and DQ2 aren't RPGs. I mean, yeah, it's a vibe, like I said. It's a vibe. 22? No way. All right, I'm 10 years older than that. I'm 32. I'm turning 33 in like in like a month or 2 months. 2 months, yeah. Wow, that's crazy. I still I can pass for like early 20s or mid 20s. That's great. That's exactly what I want to hear. That's awesome. That's what that's what working out every day and taking care of your skin does for you, fellas. Final Fantasy used to offer a robust cinematic experience in a large world, so it stood out. But so many games cover that now, making Final Fantasy feel less essential, even in the RPG space. Actually, Drew the Unspoken, I think that's actually kind of it, right? Black don't crack. True. Fair. I'm 35, so I'm saying you should know what a JRPG is. I mean, RPG is kind of just a vibe. Like people call everything an RPG. Like for example, why are Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom not RPGs? There are literally more RPG elements in those games than in say like Final Fantasy like 16, right? Like but Zelda is not an RPG. And what's funny is that despite that there are objectively more RPG elements in say Tears of the Kingdom than Final Fantasy 16, if you say FF16 is an RPG, no one will get mad. If you say Zelda is not an RPG, or no one will like push back on it. Like it's like it's bizarre to me. But like RPG is just a fucking like random like quantifier. It just doesn't say anything anymore. Or did it ever say anything? I don't know. I don't know. For example, I mean, even if you say like turn-based RPG, I know more about the game than if you say RPG. And maybe that's because you're I mean, obviously because you're kind of quantifying it like more specifically. But like RPG as like the umbrella genre just means there's numbers. That's all it means. Even older Zelda games are technically RPGs under the hood. They just hide the numbers from you unless you use certain items from the mask in like the mask in Wind Waker that shows health bars or HP numbers. Hell, Zelda 2 had levels and spells. Yeah. Zelda is not an RPG, but I've seen the argument for a long time now. You're leveling up by finding heart pieces, etc. Yeah. 16 doesn't feel like an RPG as much to me because the stats don't feel like they have weight. The itemization is off, and I find myself playing it like Devil May Cry, which is probably hard to balance. Yeah, for sure. A turn-based game that isn't an RPG is more likely a card game or chess. Can we call it chess? I mean, that's also true, right? Like if you say a game is a turn-based game, chess is a turn-based game. So you can have turn-based and not be an RPG. We have a super chat here from hold on, let me see this. Give me 1 second. Fire Kung Fu Hero with the super chat. I think the best way to control party members is in an action heavy RPG with work like FF14's hotbar controls, where you perform different party member actions like rotations. That would be interesting. I think the closest thing we have to that, Fire Kung Fu Hero, is maybe Final Fantasy VII, right? Like maybe Re-Trilogy, because it does have the hotkeys that you can set up, and you can I think that you could totally like hotkey other party members even to your own bar and like weave their attacks into yours. That'd be a cool way to do that, right? I think that that would be like very cool though. Um I think it would have been interesting if you had a system like Final Fantasy 16. It's not quite the same, but I do think it would have been interesting if, say, for example, you know how Torgal takes up every face on the D-pad? Well, like, what if the other faces on the D-pad could have been used for like Jill, right? Like if you could tap right on the D-pad and then Jill would tag into your combo. And then maybe if you held down the right button, like if you actively like held it down for like 2 seconds, well then Jill would use like a special like iconic cooldown. So she'd have like her own iconic cooldown, and you tap to use her regular ability, and then you'd hold to use her iconic ability. I think that would be like a really cool system to have made the party members in that game be more involved. I remember there was like a one moment from the trailer where they made it look like they were team attacks. So modern God of War. Yeah, you got me. Make it work just like Atreus. Yep, just like Atreus. This entire argument is one every single nerd hobby, whatever, has had in the past. One I know a little about is swords. Back in the day, people just called a sword, similar to how devs called their games RPGs. Then years and years later, people who nerd about the subject went to compartmentalize categories and everything. So now there are long swords, short swords, side swords. Yeah. Yeah. Although at least with the different swords, like, the point is to slash somebody. But yeah, every RPG is just kind of a marketing decision, really. You can call anything an RPG you want to, kind of. Like if you want to call God of War Ragnarok especially an RPG, I really don't see why you couldn't, right? Like because there are games that have less RPG elements than God of War Ragnarok and call themselves an RPG. And then there are games like Tears of the Kingdom that are so incredibly RPG in terms of like their actual mechanics, like the battle mechanics and like the gameplay loop, but then it's not an RPG. It does not make sense, right? Like for example, right? Like Genshin is an RPG, right? Actually, this may be a totally bad analogy for me to make because I only played Genshin like when it first came out. But like that game was like when that game first came out, it was like accused of being a clone of Breath of the Wild. But even though it was a clone of Breath of the Wild, it still was able to label itself RPG. But if you call actual Breath of the Wild RPG, people will be like, it's an action adventure game. Of course, now I imagine Genshin has a large amount of difference from Breath of the Wild, right? But if we're talking about 1.0, when that game first came out, and when it was labeled like a Breath of the Wild clone, but the Breath of the Wild clone was called an RPG, and the actual thing was not called it. That makes you think. Makes you think. Um, of course, I know you can get really technical about that, but an RPG is just a game with numbers, a game where you play a role, whatever that is. Yeah, I mean that's kind of my point. Is that it doesn't mean anything. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's just marketing and branding. It's a vibe. It's not a specific thing. Um, because it no longer like fighting games, like for example, like they have very specific, it's very specific imagery that comes to mind when you describe that, and usually it does describe most things that are called fighting games. Shooters, FPS, third person shooters. But yeah, RPG can just be anything. Anything they want to call an RPG can be an RPG. That's what RPG is. It's a vibe. So your channel's not an RPG channel? It is an RPG channel. It's all the games that have the vibe of role playing and numbers. That's what I mean. It's a vibe. The vibe of I take the role of a thing. And yeah. It just loosely means that stats are supposed to matter in the game, I think. That's like what an RPG is supposed to be. But even then, in a lot of action RPGs in particular, the stats don't actually matter that much. At least not in terms of the actual scale. At least some sort of world traversal must be included also. Well then that would make Cyberpunk not an RPG, right? Or something that takes place in like an entire city. So then that would make like Final Fantasy VII remake not an RPG because there's no world traversal. You just walk around like a town. But I think that any game can really include RPG elements, or like I should say, um, stat-based game design, right? Because that's like a more accurate depiction of like what's happening. I think the bigger problem which we have in eloquently described here is that RPG was a collection of mechanics working in tandem as one or whole or bigger or one bigger mechanic that we long I'm sorry, I can't read today. Let me start this over. I think the biggest problem which we have so ineloquently described here is RPG was a collection of mechanics working in tandem as one whole or one bigger mechanic that we for the longest time called a genre. Because realistically, RPG is a mechanic you can have in any game, if that makes sense. That's a great way of describing it, Crossy. RPG is a style of mechanic and not a genre. Actually, that actually kind of makes a lot of fucking sense, right? And then that's why you should change the title saying the RPG was never. something in the first place. Yeah. I think you actually found like the conclusion to my essay, like the way it rounds off, or the way it should round off. I think that's really well put, Rossi. That RPG is a mechanic. It's not necessarily a genre. Right? That's why you can make anything um, into it. Even in pen and paper like D&D, the RPG is the mechanics you use to go on the genre, right? I guess that makes sense. And like, yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think you're right. I think you're right. I can't think of anything to counter it. That makes the most amount of sense to me. I don't care what they make with FF7, with the mechanics of FF17. Please don't make it the world medieval. I don't think the world's gonna be medieval. I don't think they would do two medieval Final Fantasies in a row. If 17 was medieval, I would kind of get taken out of it. I would kind of be taken out of it, honestly, if it was. I want something very fresh for that game, so I wouldn't want it to be that. I don't want FF17 to be modern either, bro. It's because we all want the same thing. We want FF17 to be Japan. I'm telling you, we all want it to be samurai and shit. Like it's been, come on, bro. You know it. I know it. We all know it. We want Ghost of Tsushima FF17 with the katana gunblade. It's been the thing, dude. Did you like FF16 minus the Yoshi P D writing? Um, wow, okay. That was a very interesting question. I thought it was okay. Um, I thought it had some really powerful moments in it, but I also thought it was like um, really not what it needed to be at the same time. Um, if I was to make sense of it, or if I was to explain it, I guess it's like I don't know. It was okay. It was just very okay. That's like the only way I can describe it. You're a Yoshi P fanboy. I mean, I do like Yoshi P. I still like Yoshi P quite a lot. Um, that being said, yeah, I thought the game was okay. I thought the game was very okay. Clouded your judgment? Not necessarily. Like, I mean, I think anytime like the new FF is like announced, I'm always dick riding it, like for sure. And I'll probably do that when 17 comes out too. I always get excited. Here is the thing, right? Like I don't ever regret my hype. Like I'm never gonna be like, oh, this thing came out and wasn't as good as I was hoping. Like I hate myself for being that hyped. I just don't regret like it's fun to be excited for things. Yes, it's fun to be excited for things. I like being excited. It's fun. I love watching the trailers with you guys and saying this is gonna be the best one ever. It's not. but we're gonna pretend like it's gonna be the best one ever. And we're gonna get excited about it, and we're gonna look at who's working on it and the new ideas, and like I feel like that's fun. I feel like that's a fun thing. See, this is why you need to become a Dragon Quest fan, SP. Our hype is always well placed. Yuji Horii always delivers. Problem was only if the delivery was made to the West or not. Give me Dragon Quest 10 screen. I think that like, but see that's kind of like what Dragon Quest has, right? Like Dragon Quest has a sense of consistency to it, where you kind of know to some degree what the next Dragon Quest will be. That's not to say that Dragon Quest is the same thing every time, like some FF fanboys will say. Um, but it is to say that Dragon Quest is ultimately consistent. Like it is a series. Like it is. There are things. Actually, the best way to put it is Dragon Quest has an identity still, and it's still held on to its identity. Whereas Final Fantasy's identity is so tenuous that not even the people who make it know like what it is. They can't give a firm answer on it, right? And I think that's a problem because it gets to a point of where if you ask them like what Final Fantasy is, it's just kind of like, well, it's just kind of the thing that we make, and you know the spirit of challenging things and stuff like that. I kind of think they would actually benefit from having a more firm answer than that, like having a more defined answer of like, this is what our brand is, this is what this name means in like more certain terms than just like explaining like a super abstract concept that can mean anything. And I know a lot of people think that like the idea of like I know a lot of people think the idea that it could just be literally anything in any way, shape, or form, thinks they think that's kind of like what makes it exciting. And in some ways it does, right? Like, you know, going from different worlds like 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. Those are like the most popular ones. But like to a certain degree, there's also a sense of continuity within those games, and certain expectations that get fulfilled by them. And those expectations and those things are kind of the identity of the series. And so while people do love to see them play around with the setting and the progression systems and elements of the combat and things like that, they also want a thing that they know is like going to fundamentally hold it all together, right? The same sort of essence. And now these games aren't even in the same genre with each other, like whatsoever. And so you're right, Crossy, that when you go play a Dragon Quest, you know what you're kind of getting into, and you know it's going to be of a certain quality because you know that because Dragon Quest knows what Dragon Quest is. Yuji Horii knows what Dragon Quest is, right? And yeah, I don't think it's quite the same issue that Final Fantasy has, where Final Fantasy has kind of let itself be too much to the extent of where it's if something can be anything, it's nothing. I think is kind of like the best way to put it, right? Like I know. I love the idea of like, you know, let's not put Final Fantasy in a box. Let's just let it, you know, be the thing that does whatever. But to a certain degree, it does have to be a definite thing. Because if it's not a definite thing in any certain terms, then it just like then what is it actually, right? Like so it does have to have an identity of some sort. For sure. The problem is that no dev who works on FF has converted their apartment in Japan to look like a medieval town/tavern. Usually where he has done that. Oh wow. The video he did for the Nintendo Direct I'm gonna look like a set? No, that was his house. That's how much he loves his own series. He literally lives in it. That's crazy. But yeah, I think the first 10 games with Sakaguchi, I think they really had a there was a continuity there. Internet people do try to gaslight and tell you that there wasn't a continuity. I mean, honestly, not even just the first 10 games. I'd say the first 12 games, honestly. I would say that 11 and 12 also um a lot 11 and 12 also are things that I look at and I can see the continuity still with the rest of the series, even though they do use. Actually, the combat is not that drastically different. FF11 uses ATB. It's a very similar combat system to 12. Not quite, but it's pretty similar. But that ATB system is still like not drastically different. Continuity as in what? That there is an ATB system or some type of turn-based system. Command system is what they call it. That's how they group together ATB and turn-based. They call it command system. So there is some type of command system where you're able to control all characters. There is a party, um, and that party goes on an adventure around the world, on a globe-spanning adventure to save the world. Um, and there are all sorts of other tropes and uniquely FF moments and music that ties it together. And so I think that those are kind of the gameplay and story core elements to what FF is. FF7 Rebirth has all of those elements, right? Yes. FF7 Rebirth has all of those elements purely by virtue of nature of it being a remake of Final Fantasy VII alone. But yes, FF7 Rebirth has those elements, you know. And that's not to say you can't add to that identity or change certain things about it as it goes along, but you do need to have an identity. Well, Uematsu, oh, well, Matsuno, who Sakaguchi intended to continue the series after him, right? He personally scouted him from dragging from. Why can't I read today? Let me start over. I'm so sorry, Crossy. Well, Matsuno, who was well, I'm dying. Sakaguchi intended to continue the series after him, right? He personally scouted him from Quest after Tactics Ogre because he wanted him making FF games. We all know how things went with Square Enix and Matsuno during the development of 12. Arguably, the massive contention points with FF as a series are all after that. Yeah. Yeah. I would really say that because people oftentimes say 1 through 10 and I do as well, but I would actually consider 12 closer to classic FF than I would modern, quote unquote. So I would actually say 1 through 12. Um, but a lot of people push 12 more toward modern Final Fantasy, but I personally would not. I would still say that 12 is closer to what I would kind of say is classic. I would say that things kind of got more tenuous toward 13, but even then, I would say that 13's not necessarily. I don't know, actually. I might even say that 13 is not as modern as as 15 or 16, right? Because even with 13, there's still a command system, there's still a party, there's still the world spanning adventure, right? It doesn't do a lot of those things great, but 13 still has a lot of those things. So I don't know. Am I declaring 13 classic Final Fantasy today? Maybe I am. But honestly, like 15 and 15 and 16 are kind of actually like when things were like truly shaken up if you really think about it, right? Like truly different. I'm being revisionist slightly here. But like in hindsight, it kind of feels that way now that I think about it. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe it was. Maybe FF13 was the last traditional FF. Maybe we were all wrong, chat. Okay, I think we're gonna call it a stream here. I'm hungry. I'm gonna go eat some I was gonna say lunch, but I think it's technically dinner time. All right. I love you guys. Thank you all for tuning in to yet another stream. We'll be back next week. I'm doing these weekly now, if you guys haven't noticed. So there's going to be a stream once every week, at least. I might start doing two, but I kind of don't want to just like not stream anymore like I was for a while. So we'll do like once a week streams.